Came back to the church. I was studying it with the reason that if God called this church into existence, he did so in place and time. And if he did, I'm a little hot, guys, I think. If he did call us, it probably would be a good idea to know something of our history. Amen. You know, because there the story is told. And I had no problem taking this story through to the conclusion of why he raised us up. I believe he raised up the Adventist church just as surely as he raised up Martin Luther with the gospel in the 16th century. He raised us up to give the last message to the world, the three angels' messages, the last message of hope. Amen. And after that, there is no other. We read the second coming. So we're at the end, folks, for that kind of message. But I asked a question as I was going through these places, because this is where it came out of, it birthed out of, ran into western New York, Finger Lakes area, then into Michigan, to Battle Creek. And I said, well, where did it really begin? The possibility was always there. But what event happened that put the dominoes in effect? Some event happened. And that event, because of that event, all known to the person who experienced it, you and I are sitting here today. Amen. Where was that event? A great disappointment? That's one. That's not a bad, that's okay. You might think of some other things. And those are turning points. Those are very important points. We can talk about several points along the way. But let's get back to the first domino that tipped over. That maybe, and maybe I'm wrong. After I get done, you might think something a little further. Oh, that started it. And so, and I'm talking not just the preparation of what God would do to bring the church about, but the event, the thing that happened, that triggered, events that followed, that would bring us to where we are today. And so, I found myself standing, and I took this picture, on the shores of Lake Champlain. And I contemplated that, about the beginning of Adventism. And so I thought I would share that there with you. We'll see if I can get this. Now, I do have an audio here, and I don't know if the audio's up. If not, it's not the end of the world. It's actually my fault. I have two audios on here. See if I can get one working. Nope. So anyways, we won't worry. Don't worry about it. William Miller sitting in his study. Remember Keepers of the Flame back in the day? And that's the actor that played William Miller. That's my Bible teacher from Academy, Gerald Wassmer. So it was interesting. He played a good part. But he's sitting here at his desk contemplating God's call. He heard the words. What were the words he heard that Saturday morning in his study? Remember? Tell it to the world. Tell it to the world. Now, we had a film out a few years back called Tell the World. That wasn't what William Miller heard. That was a different, they used that word tell the world in a different context. I thought it might be attached to William Miller. It wasn't. But William heard tell it to the world. What was he supposed to tell? Telling of Jesus. What he had been studying about the coming of Christ. And he says to himself, Lord, look, I'm not a preacher. I'm just a farmer. You've got to get somebody else to do this stuff. And he kept getting that pressure on him, that voice in the back of his head telling him, tell it to the world. I set you as a watchman, he says. And Miller finally concedes the pressure's too great. He says, okay, if somebody asks me, and I understand that word, if somebody asks me to preach, and preach on this topic, not just preach, and preach on this subject, I'll go. And all pressure was gone. Peace. No one had ever asked him before. Why should they ask him now? Right? 20 minutes later comes the knock. Some of you know the story. His 16-year-old nephew from up in Dresden came down and said, Father sent me. Father was the head deacon. Father sent me to ask you to come preach tomorrow. This was Saturday. So and I got an invitation, one. He's halfway home, halfway there, got an invitation to preach. He says, if you come preach tomorrow, because the pastor won't be there, and that if you would preach on what you'd been studying in Daniel and Revelation. That did it. And of course, we know what William Miller did. He jumped up and hallelujah, right? No, he didn't. What did he do? He didn't say a word. His nephew's home, and they're at the house visiting, gives the message. William, looking down, discussed it, leaves the study, and walks out the back door. And he makes a right down the hill and up into the maple grove. Little Lucy was following after. She always followed her dad out to the barn to do work, and she followed him outside, but he made a right. She kept going. She stopped, went back in the house, and told Mom something's wrong with Daddy. Spent about 20 minutes there in the maple groves trying to convince God, you know, I'm not the preacher. And of course, we know, reading Midnight Cry, Nichols' book there, where he gives us the story, he says, William went into the maple grove a farmer, and he came out a preacher. He acquiesced to what God had asked him to do. So he went up to Dresden. Immediately up at Dresden, instead of preaching for one day, it broke out into a revival, about 2 weeks. And after that, he got a call from where he had been living before when he got married. Remember, he was in Pulteney right after he got married. That was about 4 miles from the house. And so he went to Pulteney and did another 2 weeks, and he never had time where he didn't have an appointment. They came in, and he began preaching. And this is just the scene where the nephew comes to the door to ask him. So this is where we find our beginnings here, but there's an event that happened before that. And this event caused quite a stir. With his message, there's this house here. This house look familiar to anybody? We went up to Gorham, Maine to look for Ellen White's house. And there was 2 of them up there that were said to be. The first place we went to had the marker. I'll show you the marker here in a second. Across the street from the marker was an empty plot, empty land. The house that had been on it, that was said to be Ellen's home, had burned to the ground. Anybody know Michael Campbell, Professor Michael Campbell? The book's 1919, 1922, and then in March, you'll have the 1925 book. I'm going to do a Zoom class on those 3 books. And they tell about the period right after the 1919 Bible conference. Okay? So it's very interesting stuff. So he's with us. When he was a kid, he got over there to that side and got bricks from the foundation's still there, but we can't go over there because it's private property. But he got 23 bricks years ago. Bricks from Ellen White's house. What a treasure. Then he finds out it's not Ellen White's house. So he got 23 bricks. They searched the records, and no Robert Harmon ever bought the place. That's Ellen's dad. So, but down the street, this house, and I only got this driving by in the van. I was on the correct side of the van, camera against the window, and as he come screaming by, I went click. That's the house. There was only one house, and that's it. They had siding on it now. It's a lot nicer looking. But it's still there. 200 years, still there.
Same house?
Yeah, same house. It's sided, been kept up, fixed up. People are living in it. And the garage, of course, wasn't attached there. There was a part with it, an overhang with one back wall used as a stable for the horse. So, but that's been fixed up like a regular 2-car garage, been added and everything. But that's her house. And that's just down the street. And it's on the same street, about a mile and a half down from where the other house was. So there she was. And she was born there in the house, her and her twin sister, Elizabeth. That's the marker that was up the road a bit. It's on the other side of the road from where the house was that burned down. So we go there just because that's where the marker is. So, but the house is down the street. I said, well, why don't we just pull our vans up in the drive and knock on the door? Well, one place we pulled off to take a picture of the house, we kind of got run off because even though nobody was living on there, again, it was on private property. It was not Adventist. And we technically, we weren't even on the property, but we were there to simply point it out, talk about it, take a picture. That's all. So nobody was roaming around doing anything. In fact, I stayed in the van. I gave my camera to Michael and said, hey, give me a couple shots. And he did. So we have Ellen White, because that's the school. You know, the family moved to Portland, Maine. And there's the school, the Brackett Street School. Notice that it sells fresh, what? Affections or something? It's a grocery store. I bought my lunch in there. So I bought my lunch where Ellen White went to school. Wow. Okay? I like that they kept the building useful. They didn't, it's not just sitting there empty and tore down or anything. It's being used for something. That was the school she came home from in the 3rd grade when they were 9 years old, her and her sister. And some older girl, she was about 13, was teasing her, threw a rock at her. As Ellen turned, the rock hit her beside the nose in the sinus area, crushed the sinus into the face. And we know that story there. That was there. The newer school is across the street. The Brackett Street School is still there, but it's on the other side of the street. I don't think it's the school that replaced this one. There had to have been a couple in between, I'm thinking. Just thinking. But it's interesting, there's still a school there, even though it's on the other side of the street. You know. This is not the church that her family got kicked out of, but it's in the spot where the church was. That church is tore down. Another Methodist church has been built up. So we kind of get the sense of where they were. They had a big fire in Portland back in the days, and a lot of the areas got burned up. We don't know where Ellen lived. We don't have a picture of her house there in Portland, Maine. But out of this church here, toward the end of the Millerite movement, they get kicked out because of the Millerite message. And this really sours Elizabeth, Ellen's sister. She never again manifests any real interest in religion. And Ellen tried throughout the years to reach out to her sister. Every new book Ellen would publish, she would send it to her, send her a copy. Lizzie, if she kept them, she had every book Ellen White ever wrote. Toward the end of her life, Elizabeth had lost a child in labor. Ellen knew what that was like. She lost one right after birth, little John, and then she lost Henry. So she knows what it was to lose a child, and she tried to appeal to her sister. And basically with the message of, let God put that baby back in your hands at the resurrection. And nothing of that seemed to work. And she died never really accepting Christ. Wow. This is her grave, Lizzie's. Her husband's on the left. There's a picture of the girls. Ellen is on your right. Lizzie's on the left at the desk. And if you see the dates, it's kind of hard to try to control the contrast or where we're at here. Yeah, that's about the best I can see. The contrast here says she was born, on November 18, 1826. Now, anybody who's a historian here, when was Ellen White born? What's her birthday? Oh, man, you're going to have to stay after class. I'm just saying. Ellen says, in a form she filled out, she said, oh, my birthday is November 26, 1827. So Ellen was born a year after her sister, which we know that's not true. But Ellen had been known to write her sister toward the end of her life, you know. Lizzie, she says, just what year were we born? You know how it was back in those days. They didn't have like the records they keep today. A lot of that stuff was just a family Bible. And so here they are, a year apart, and on the wrong day, the 18th, not the 26th. You know, we find Ellen could have been born anywhere from 26 to 28. You know, I think we're probably closer with the 27 day. Maybe Elizabeth was more off, but I find that interesting. And then I contemplate, if she's born in 28, and Henry was born in the spring of 47, how old would Ellen be? And I'd say she'd be way too young to be having babies. Babies having babies, you know. Of course, that was kind of in the thing that day. In those days, a lot of young people got married and had kids right away. But it was interesting. This was where she was. And her last name, as you can see it on there, was Bangs. So what an interesting name. We found this little tombstone in a graveyard out that way. Can you read it? It says, barely read it. It's almost covered completely. The name on it is Hazen Foss. Hazen Foss. He was the prophet God went to take the message to the people, and he refused. And then finally, when he relented and he tried to give the message, he couldn't remember it. And then he went to Ellen. Now, the first one was Foy. And he was a black man in that time. And in our older literature, we read that Foy rejected God. So we had two prophets that reject God before he went to Ellen. But that's not so. Foy never rejected God. He did everything God told him to do. He was a minister to the day he died. He died in the early 80s, 1880s. I'm thinking around 1881. He was a preacher till the day he died. Had a house, a little farm, preached. Faithful. He was faithful. He wrote and published his visions. He heard Ellen White and confirmed to her, God showed me those same things. But not Hazen Foss. He came to her and heard a meeting, and he says, don't you give up on that. He says, I'm a lost man. So you continue to hear that. So Foy was faithful. But in the society that we lived in, even in the North, a message going to a larger population from a black man, God knew he would have problems. Yeah. I mean, Ellen White had problems as a woman. Yeah. You know, so, but he went to the weakest of the weak. He took this young woman who herself was pushing back. Why me? I mean, I understand that too. I was, you know, you've heard my story. God sent me. I'm at Andrews. My track is to be a study for the ministry, and I'm saying to God, me? I mean, you really reached down to the bottom of the barrel here. I can't preach. I talk like I have a mouthful of rocks, still do. I can't sing so bad I hurt my feelings. You know? And being an extreme introvert, you know, introverts aren't people. I said, don't you have to like people first? He never told me that wasn't a prerequisite. I mean, so it took me 22 years to come back. But at least I didn't run away forever. You know, he never left me. Amen. During that time. And I want you to know that. Hound of heaven. God is like a relentlessly pursues you. Remember that. Anytime you have those dark days, he's relentless. So, Hazen Foss was in his early 70s when he passed. And this is the saddest stone in a line of family stones that you have. Everybody's got nicer stones. He's got this rock in the ground almost covered up. In fact, in order to take the picture, and I was helping other people, I'm pulling away dirt and grass growing over it so we can get a better picture of it. I wish I had a bottle of water I could throw on it, because you know how that helps to bring the relief up. I didn't have one with me. I could barely walk. I blew my knees out on the first day. I was a wreck the whole week. You know, I guess I'm still carrying signs of it right now. So Ellen, she marries James. They accept the Sabbath in October of 46. And then in 47, in August of 47, Henry's born. They're living with their parents back in Gorham, Maine, at the house. I guess the parents moved back. I'm not sure. In October, there was a family they knew, the Howlands, and brother and sister Howland had offered a place for them to live. And there was a lady that would help them. So here's the house there in Thompson, Maine. And it's interesting because if you get the books, you see the Thompson house here, and it sits on the property, and it's on a rounded front, like a rounded corner. It's a drawing. I think Spalding has it in his 2-volume book, which is now 4 volumes. We published it in the 60s. And, but they moved the house. The house has been moved across the street. So it's right across from where it originally was, where they were living. But the Whites had moved up in the attic. The attic was unfinished. And that's where they lived, with borrowed furniture. Good first place, right? Good memory. Ellen was depressed about that, a baby in her hand. And she said that she vowed they were going to earn their way, you know, instead of being dependent on other people like that. And, but that was a place that they found that would accept them so they could go do their work. Henry lived at that place for the first 4 years of his life. It was there that he died. And years later in 63, when some things were happening, the family took the kids, went out east to the old territory to preach and stuff, and they all settled at the house, and the kids stayed at the house while the parents went out to preach. And what happened? Henry and Edson were playing down by the river, not too far away. It was a cool day. And then when they got back, they were kind of a little tired. He laid down on a pile of wet canvas. You remember the old prophecy chart, William Miller chart? That was printed on canvas directly. And the reason why is that was your PowerPoint of the day. And you carried that with you, and if it got wet, it was okay, it didn't ruin it. But James, I don't know if he had the money, if it was more expensive to print directly on the canvas or what. He had it printed on paper. And then they glued it to the canvas. I saw one of those charts there at William Miller Chapel. And what you got to do is you got to wet the canvas. Because you put the wet paper on it, on dry canvas, when it dries, it's just going to pop off or wrinkle up. So you got to wet the canvas, the glue wets the paper, put it on, and everything dries together. So here are these damp canvases. Henry lays on them. Windows open, you get the chill, turns into pneumonia. In those days, they were still bleeding you. I think that's really what killed him. He was bled to death. You know, kept him in a dark room, no ventilation. This is just before the water chair. And that's why when Ellen tapped onto that, she was sure this wasn't going to take another one of her sons. So, but this is how he died, and they took him back. Very important place in the story of our message. And here I show the cemetery. The one who gave him the furniture was Clarissa Bonfoy. Her parents had just passed. She must have had siblings. They divided the furniture. She had furniture enough to set up like a little household. And so she loaned it to the Whites at the house there at Thompson, so they had furniture. And she stayed and watched the baby while they went on their way and to the church and come back and stuff. And she stayed with them all the way through to Battle Creek. And you know the story. Ellen White's there at that church in Battle Creek, and she gives her vision of the food for worms. Some will be food for worms before Christ comes. Others will live to see him come, etc. And she says, oh, I fear I won't see it. I'll be food for worms. And within 30 days, she was dead. 35 years old with nothing wrong with her. She is the first one buried in the family plot. I went to the White estate. They said baby John was the first one buried in the family plot, but he wasn't buried there until 63. So, Clarissa, she was buried there in 56. First one was not a family member. See where the little flag is up front of the family square? Followed all the way to the end. Very end is where Clarissa is buried. Next to her is Deacon John, James White's father, I'm sorry, his mother, and then Deacon John. Her name is not even on the tombstone. His name is Deacon John White, and whatever, and she's Mrs. John White. You know, my wife gets these phone calls. Oh, are you Mrs. Karl Wagner? She says, I am not. I'm not Mrs. Karl Wagner, and he's not Mr. Diana Wagner. So, but that was how it was in the day. And then you had Henry, John, and then Ellen and James. They were on that row. The other side, first three stones you see, is Willie with his two wives, not at the same time. And down to the other end is Edson with his wife. He was only married to one time. And you see, there's in the middle of the gap, they got space there for two more. I hear they're selling lottery tickets so that you can be buried with the Whites. Come up in the resurrection together. I'm just kidding. Don't look around for the lottery tickets. But I was wondering, that's two plots of land in a cemetery, not going to be filled. You know, cemetery is prime real estate. Especially that one's pretty full. So talking about Ellen White and James here at the beginning of this whole movement, you know, we talk about what Ellen White wrote, what she said in all of her books and things. You know, if all she did was this right here, see, if that's all, God used her in a mighty way. And sometimes we don't see that. An Advent Christian friend of Francis Nichols was talking to him and said, you guys must have smarter leaders than we had, because we're still a small church and you guys are growing so rapidly. Francis Nichols says, we're not smarter. We had somebody among us. We had a gift, gave us advice and counsel. We followed it. She was the one who helped with the publishing. In fact, we can go back to number one. We can go back to 1 Prime. She was the one after the disappointment. We had all given it up. It was in the past. She's with some other girls there in December of 1844. And she breaks out in a vision. And what did the vision say? The vision basically said this: the experience you had back there in 44 is genuine, authentic. Don't give it up. We had given it up. She says, that's a genuine experience. That was the basis of the message. That message alone coalesced so many people into what would become Seventh-day Adventists. Here, publishing. She was at a big supporter. Nichols, old Mr. Nichols there, and I mean, he wasn't old then, he was about 40, 42. I say that now because I'm well past that. But she was there, they were very supportive of the Adventist message and any Adventists to come through, a place to sleep, food, lodging, especially of Ellen and James. And she was there visiting with them on November 8th, 1848. And she had a vision. The vision was, publish a paper. God told her, publish a paper. The paper started off small, but it will go around the world and get big. Joseph Bates had a fit. He wanted to publish little tracts and keep passing them out. Jesus is coming imminently, any minute. And you want to make a paper? Are you settling down to stay here on earth, or are we going to go home? That's kind of like what he was thinking. So they had a little fight. Now, Joseph Bates and the Whites, they were the founders of the church. And the real founder, probably, as George Knight says, was probably George Bates. But here was the struggle. And it wasn't a bad struggle, but a struggle that had to be gone through, where we had the change of leadership. From the older Bates to these young people, James and Ellen White. Well, now they were the leaders. And Bates stayed with it. His service was right up until he died, 76. He opened up Michigan for us, let alone the work he's going to do right here. So this publishing business was really important. We were a publishing business before we were a denomination. Getting the word out. This was a cutting-edge technology. Now today, if Ellen was today, she'd be using all kinds of things, computers and Facebook and YouTube and whatever, to get the word out. Then as we moved to Battle Creek and we begin to coalesce, we begin to think about church organization. Now, You know how it was that Adventists got kicked out of other churches? And they had very bitter feelings about organizations. They said, the minute you organize, at once, you are Babylon. We're not going to organize. So what do you want, disorganization? I mean, Ellen knew that we needed to organize so we could own property, so we could do the work, the vehicle for carrying the work out. We didn't organize just to be another denomination. We're a movement, still today a movement, primarily. But the organization was to help us with getting the message out, owning property, doing whatever we needed to do collectively. She helped us do that. We took the name October 1, 1860, Seventh-day Adventist. That was based off a placard that was up in Hillsdale, Michigan. Lupperl did a series up there, and it was called, and he referred to themselves as the Seventh-day Advent people. And that's where we took the name from, Seventh-day Adventist. So, organized by 63, we began to bring in churches. And by 63 in May, we were organized as the General Conference. Right after that 2 weeks, Ellen White has a vision on health, about pork, namely pork, not about eating anything else, not Leviticus 11, just pork. Pork is entirely unfit for food. This is in June. They've already sold the house on Wood Street. If you're familiar with the house, the White's house there on Battle Creek, they'd already sold that, just sold that. Right up, their house was on Wood Street, and right to the right of the house was Campion. And down at the corner was our sanitarium. And on the corner there in Washington and Campion was a house that they bought. That was a house they were fixing up when they went east with the boys, where Henry died. And so the health message all started there. And by 66, we had the sanitarium built. See, they were buying that property up there, the Whites were, because they were going to use it. They bought it in chunks. And it was owned by there was a large piece owned by a very famous judge in Michigan. They got the property. So you can see what she's doing. Ellen White is putting the wheels on the Adventist movement. Organizing, publishing, organizing as a church, the health message, building of the sanitarium, and then the education. Education had already started back at Bucks Ridge with Byington's daughter. Now you know who John Byington is? He's our first president of the General Conference. And he's out of New York. His daughter, very young, she was a teacher, a good teacher. She started a school, about 23 kids. So education wasn't entirely new in Adventism, but here in Battle Creek, a man by the name of Goodloe Harper Bell came down to the hospital we had there and was getting some help. And he liked the idea of this education, of educating and manual labor, teaching a trade. And this fit right in line with Ellen White. Her teenage boys and everything, and other boys in the neighborhood, they were working at different Adventist institutions, like the printing house, the Review. And while they were working there, Edson saw him outside chopping wood and struck up a conversation. Found out his name, found out what he did, and he asked him, could you teach us? It was about 3 to 4 boys, because they're out of school now. They're coming in, they're working part-time, their basic education is over with, but they want more education. And he said he would. And when the word got around, many other kids were asking, hey, can we join too? And so he built a school. He didn't build a schoolroom, he got a school together. The Review and Herald, the original building, and replaced by a new one, much nicer looking. So they took the old one, moved it down the street. And that's where they did school. And the floor, on the first floor, is where Goodloe Harper Bell lived with his wife and children. They had school upstairs. So it went on for a while. And then they thought, as they got it together, and Ellen was behind all this, they should really vote to get a real school going. And by 1874, Battle Creek College was formed. It was, however, first grade through college. It wasn't just a college like we think of. But it started in 1874. So she really pushed us here through to get us to first college. The first years were really bumpy. The second guy there, Brownsburger, is from Perrysburg. Anybody know where Perrysburg is? Perrysburg, Ohio. You know that? I'm from Toledo. And Perrysburg is right across from Maumee, where my father-in-law's from. My mother-in-law's from Perrysburg. My father-in-law's from Maumee. They both looked down their noses at each other. Maumee was the working class. Perrysburg was more of the middle to upper class. We call this snooty side of town. And, but they got married. They're still married. They live with us. My wife's home with her mother right now. So I have some connection here. They're right in my own hometown. One of the first teachers up at Battle Creek College. And not just at Battle Creek. Later on, when he left, under some bad circumstances of what was happening at the college, he ended up getting a job out in Hillsburg in California at a school. So who knows? So anyways, this education almost faltered. And that's when Goodloe Harper Bell, with Stephen Haskell, went out to South Lancaster, Massachusetts, and formed a school there that later would develop into Atlantic Union College. So it all started. Ellen White put those wheels on. And the last wheel to go on was in 1874 as well, when we sent J.N. Andrews over to Europe as our first official missionary. Yeah, we had one before. His name was Michael. Michael, what was that? Gorcheski. Yes. And he was a priest who converted to Protestantism, came to America, converted to Adventism, wanted us to pay him to go back to his country to give the message to his family. We weren't even organized yet. We had no money. So what he did, he went and got funding from the Advent Christian Church, the Sunday church. Went over to England, went back home to Europe on that money, and set up Seventh-day Adventist churches on the Advent Christian dime. Naturally, when they found out, they stopped funding him. But so when we sent John over, John Andrews, he gets over there. A guy says, "Hey, you got you got other Adventist churches around here you didn't know about." So that's how that mission's all started. But Ellen White put the wheels on this movement. It's why we were the smallest at the beginning and why we're nearly 23 million today. Of any Advent group, we're the biggest. Because she set it down for success, for organization. We know what we're about. So I got to point that way. We also stopped down south of Boston in Fairhaven, across the river from New Bedford. Fairhaven and New Bedford used to be the same town, but because New Bedford still liked the King of England, they changed their name in Fairhaven. Now, he wasn't born here, but he was a young boy when they brought him here. He was born in Massachusetts. But this is the house where he was reared. This is the house where he worked out of when he was an adult as a sailor. The ocean, where the ships would dock, a walking distance from this house. And of course, there are buildings there now, but it was all open field then. He could walk right through them, and he could easily see the ships coming in. And so it was very easy. He would look out his window and dream of being a ship's captain. So this was really an important place where the story begins there of Joseph Bates. We know that he was the progenitor of the Sabbath day. We know that up in Washington, New Hampshire, Frederick Wheeler got the Sabbath message from Rachel Oakes, and that he must have shared it with another friend who was a itinerant minister, T.M. Preble, who wrote an article. That article was published into a tract, and that tract was a tract that Bates got. He read it. He walked up to New Hampshire, Washington, New Hampshire, visited with Frederick Wheeler all night. Then they went over to the Farnsworth property and had another meeting. So when he came back home, there was the bridge from New Bedford across to Fairhaven. And we went to the embankment. The bridge is no longer there. And he meets someone who says, "What's the news, Mr. Bates?" And he says, "The Sabbath is the seventh day." Gave him a Bible study right there on the bridge. So he really helped promote the Sabbath, and it would take our group from being not just another Adventist group, but a Sabbatarian Adventist group. Would become the Seventh-day Adventist. He, as Bates, as I noted before, George Knight said, probably Bates is the real founder of Seventh-day Adventism. And that's not saying that Ellen and James are, not important, but if you look at one person. I always said of the three, if you look for number 4, that was important, would be J. and Andrews. That's how important Andrews was to the message. In fact, by 52 even, he's still our main evangelist who goes out and preaches. So that's how important J.N. is. The man knew 7 languages, could read and speak them. So he would study his Greek on the back of a plow as he was plowing the field. I hope the horse knew to keep it straight because he was reading. So, but that's what he would do. So, and of course, talking about Andrews, this is a site map. The green line is Main Street. Down by the little picture you see there, the blue dot is where Atlantic Union College is. You stay on Main Street, it wraps up and around, and there we see J. and Andrews' home that he was living in just before he went overseas. He wasn't there very long. His wife had died. He was there with his 2 kids, Charles and Mary, and then he left in '74 from that point. But this is the old college. This is the original Haskell building that was built in like '96. And then we went up to this house here. Now that house is on private property. We pulled off to the side. We took some pictures. This is from the computer. This here is. And we got run off. He was really angry. "Don't you people read your own papers?" he says. "Oh, out of 23 million people? Sorry, I didn't get the memo." So, but we left. There was no disturbance, but we did get some pictures. And but that was the house he was in. The door in the front is just simply a piece of wood. There is no door. Nobody's living in the place. So, but Andrews, this is at the statue at Andrews University. He left in '74 to be our first missionary. Mary is the little girl up front. She's about not quite 14 yet. And she is an unsung hero. The work she did for her dad was magnanimous. She was a beautiful young spirit who died of tuberculosis at 16, almost 17 years old. It was a sad ending. Her dad, so close to her, he evidently got the TB from her because after he brought her back to Battle Creek, where she would not be able to, they couldn't help her much, so she passed away. And then he went back over to Europe, and he died there from TB. Behind him is Charles. Charles stayed in Europe and did a great work as a pastor and everything. But he was our first guy to go out. Here we are at the cemetery of the Smith family. This is the Annie Smith stone. There's that big stone that you see here on the right under the blue bar. And to the left here, to the far left, you see that little bitty stone on the ground, that little white stone. That says Annie. There's a stone further left with a brother's name on it. And behind the big stone, there are 2 other little stones that says Mother and Father. So they used the big stone as kind of like a monument, put everybody's name on it. And in the middle of that is Annie's name when she died on July 26, 1855. And it was just before that her brother had joined them. But she was already gone from the office at Saratoga before they moved to Rochester. And she was back home where she convalesced and died. So 26 years old. It was a sad story. But both have interesting stories. In 1844, she had embraced the doctrine of the soon coming of Christ, but at 16, and she was 16, and after 1844, she lost interest in Adventist teaching. She was going to go on, become a teacher, all that, had secular ideas in mind, and she was converted. She was converted by Bates. Her mother, Rachel, Smith's, Annie's mother, Rachel, her name is Annie Rachel Smith, has Mom's name. But Rachel writes to Bates, because she was a Millerite too. She was the one who brought the girls in. The father Samuel never was religious, never claimed the message. He died an unbeliever. The building, that's her house, that's a tavern. Now, not a tavern like you and I think. These are roadside places, because as the horse and carriages that came by, they had a place where they could stop, refresh their horses themselves, get food, maybe have a place to sleep, like an inn. So it wasn't just a bar, but they called it a tavern. And so that's what it was. They may have lived in the building somewhere, or they may have built outbuildings. This was a big property at the time. There's houses on it now, and there was no trees. It's all farming land. You go there now, it's like in the middle of a forest. Yeah. All second growth. But Bates got it. What happened, God gave her and Bates a dream, the opposite. Bates had a dream about a young girl coming in, and where she came in the door, couldn't find a place, she came in late, found a place by the door to sit down, and that he was to give her the message. Preach on the 2,300 days. That's what he's supposed to do. So that was his dream. Her dream was that she was to go there to this meeting, and when she dreamt, she walked in, couldn't find a place to sit, sat by the front door, and saw the man up there preaching. And that was the man she was supposed to see. So they were connected. So when he saw her come in and sit down, he knew that's the girl of his dream. And he changed the sermon midstream, right to the 2,300 days. Now, whether anybody caught it or not, I don't know. But he changed it. So he helped bring her back. She went to work for the Whites in the paper. She wrote poetry and all that. She was really very good. So she had a loss of her experience and gained it back. But so did Uriah. 1844 came, 12-year-old boy, disappointed. Same year, they cut his leg off. Thanks a lot. That was a very good year, 1844 for Smith. And he had a cyst on his leg for a long time that wouldn't heal. The doctor suggested they cut it off. He had an amputation just down the street in somebody's kitchen. Without anesthesia. Took him 12 minutes to cut it off. Without anesthesia, 12 minutes is a long, long time. So you can imagine his disposition. Somebody cut my leg off without anything, I probably would be grumpy too. But he did make a return, and he came back in. He accepted the message taught by the Adventist. So they both had similar kind of stories on coming through. That's their house there, and more of a front view. The lady that lives there is not a Seventh-day Adventist. And she's been giving Adventist tours for years. We pulled up, they called ahead of time. Our vans pulled up front on the street, and we all piled in. 25 people crowding into this woman's home, who's not an Adventist. And she was just a darling. She had to have been pushing 90, I think. I don't know, she was, maybe not quite 90, but I tell you, she's pushing it. If she's not 90, she's in spelling distance. Okay? And just as gracious as can be. Let us tromp around her house. And she met Jim Nix there. He met her there and talked to her years ago about the significance of the house and shared some material with her. And she had up in the corner of the living room some books, and she had a couple biographies on Smith, and she had his Daniel and Revelation and all that. So she kind of got brought up to date on who it was. And just a gracious lady. We had a nice time. So she's not the one that ran us off the property. It was a Jay and Andrews home, got us run off. So we were looking for another place. Where else can we get run off from? So we behaved. And the other places we didn't go, we were too far east to come back here to the Finger Lakes of New York, south of Lake Ontario. Rochester, of course, where we went and put our office for the first time. We got our first printer, the Washington printer, hand press. We were publishing our own paper. First place was 120 Hope Street. Started publishing our own paper. We didn't have to have it printed. They wrote it all up, took it to our printers, he printed it. We didn't have to do that anymore. And we could print tracts and other things too. So it was really nice. Up in that second dot above the Finger Lakes there is about where Port Gibson was. That's where Hiram Essen's farm was, with his friend there, O.R.L. Kreuzer and Dr. F.B. Hahn. And the great morning after the disappointment. Remember, he was out in the cornfield with Kreuzer, and he got stopped there, and Kreuzer gets to the other end and looks back and, what's wrong? He says, I'm getting an answer to this morning's prayer. And that's when he saw that Christ, he said, first off, he says, the earth was not the sanctuary. It was in heaven. Christ went into the Holy of Holies, he saw, there to do a work for us until he comes. And so that was the beginning of our sanctuary message. And he'd moved several places there. He helped with the hand press. He helped fund that. Cost us about, they say 700, and I've heard things where extra money was put in. So it may have reached as high as $800 for the press and all the typeset and everything. And now we don't have a picture of that press. It burned in the fire when the Review and Herald went. So when we were visiting another site a few days before, this place was called the publishing house or printing house or something. And in there they had two presses, and one of them was a Washington hand press. So I did get a couple of pictures of a Washington hand press finally. And that other dot tells of another pioneer that's important to us, and that was J.N. Loughborough. And this is the area he worked at. This was he set up some churches post 1844 as a young boy with clothes too big, holes in them even. And his people in the churches he helped set up said, hey, these Sabbatarians are moving in, taking our people. What are you going to do about it? You got to go out and set them straight. And so in about 1852, he writes, actually on his hand, all the Bible texts he's going to use to set them straight. So he goes up there, sits there in a meeting. J.N. Andrews comes out, he's going to speak. He comes up to the pulpit and says, I'm going to change what I'm going to speak about. I'm going to change it, and he begins talking on the Sabbath. I don't know what he was going to speak on, but he started on the Sabbath. And he started using the text that Loughborough wrote on his hand. And that's not just amazing enough. He did them in the order he wrote them. Wow. Needless to say, we know the end of that story. Yeah. Loughborough became an Adventist. Amen. So these are the initial real pioneers. That's in Haskell, Loughborough, J.N. Andrews, Dwight, Smith, people like that. There's a lot of other people, like I mentioned, like the Nichols family and others, who were important. But these were main people were the first line, the first generation pioneers. We got that second generation, like W.W. Prescott, A.G. Daniels, Kellogg, other people like that. Those are second generation. But this is your first prime generation coming through to give the message. But it all stems from William Miller, him preaching about the end of the world. He was born in 1782, died in 49, just 5 years after the disappointment. And he was still in his 60s when he died. He's buried right down the street. If you look at the houses, go down this way, first right is Golf Club Street. I don't think it was called Golf Club Street of today, but that's what they call it now. And you see a cemetery, and the cemetery, you go to the maps, and they mark the cemetery as the Miller Graveyard. He's got a lot of other people in it. I don't think that's all his family, but it's noted as the Miller Graveyard. And from the street, you can see where he's buried. You can see, if you know the stones, you can see the stones standing on the street because they're big stones. But we are going to take our story to the beginning. He had become a deist, You know what a deist is? A deist believes that there is a God. He created the world, made everything, set it in motion. And then he left. And everything winds down. And when you die, for most deists, when you die, you're dead. That's it. Now, well, there's some deists who believed in reincarnation of some sort. But mostly, there was a bad ending, eternal death. And that's about the closest he could find. He was never fully satisfied with it. The idea of death terrified him. So, but this was the closest thing he saw that he could kind of agree with. His family were Southern Baptists. He had some problems with that. Dad was never religious, but he was a patriot, free of country. He was in the Revolutionary War. His dad was a captain, Captain Miller, same name. His grandfather was captain, was Mr. Miller, William Miller. So he had 3 Williams in a row. So William Miller wasn't a junior, he was at least William Miller the third. And his dad was captain, Miller became a captain. When the war happened, he became a captain there. They raised him to the rank from lieutenant to captain. And so this was his experience at the Battle of Plattsburgh up there at Lake Champlain, 100 miles from his home, just up north. Took place on September 11, 1814. And we had our own 9/11, so to speak, that affected what would be the Adventist church. And it says the British, he writes up there as he's writing to his wife, he describes how the British were only 10 miles from where they were. And he says, and he wrote this on the 4th of September, we expect a battle tomorrow, he says. Well, it didn't take place till the 11th. And I think they must be, put the word in there, fools, if they do not attack us, as they are 10 or 11,000 strong, and we're only 1,500. But every man is determined to do his duty. So they weren't, you can see the odds there. They're supposed to lose this, the Americans. They're sending quite a force down. He says, it may be my lot to fall, he tells his wife. If I do, I will fall bravely. He said, remember, you will never hear from me if I'm a coward. So if he's a coward, he ain't going back home. He says, I must close as it's almost 11 o'clock. And that was written near Camp Moreau in Plattsburgh. If you look at the map, where the fort, there were 3 forts. It wasn't like there was a grand fort, Plattsburgh. There were 3 forts, and they weren't very fancy, small. But they were set up with guns to crossfire. So they're in strategic places. And the middle fort was Moreau. The top fort was Brown, and I can't remember the back fort yet. I keep forgetting that one. But he was there. So he was right in the thick of it. He wasn't off somewhere fighting some small group. He was right in the thick of it, where he started. This is a quick battle here. Coming down Lake Champlain, I'll show you the map here in a little bit. They had to pass a peninsula. The boats, the British came down and had to come around that side to get to the Americans. And as they showed up, as they come around that horn on the peninsula, they fired a salty. Just kind of say, hello guys, we're here. And the Americans are saying, we acted like it was nothing. Otherwise they weren't scared. And so that was the beginning of setting it up there. And so here it is, here's on the map. You can see the horn up here on the top left, the little peninsula coming out. Right around that, I drew a green line, would come into the bay area there. That's the Plattsburgh Bay. And that's essentially where the battle took place. And it was quite a battle. Here's an old map. And the ships decided to come up the river so they could take the city and fight the forces here. And there's the forts. And that one there in the middle is Fort Monroe. That's where William was. Oh, Prescott. I think I'd remember that one. That was down at the bottom there. So, and they had one bridge to that. There was an island, technically. They had one bridge over to it. So the ships were going to come down there. And that was the plan. The Vermont, New York, they were threatened from Lake Champlain. This is in reference to the whole 1812 battles. I'm from Toledo, right on the edge of Lake Erie. I know about the Battle of Lake Erie in Ontario. Lake Erie was by Commodore Perry, and he took them. They never had a problem there again. He put into an island called Put-in Bay, is where he had his ships. That today is a party island. I've been to it many times. This island's full of bars and hanging out and everything. That was back in my heathen days. Just don't tell them Adventists I was there, okay? So Vermont, however, Vermont and New York, they weren't threatened by a Great Lake. You know, those lakes have a common border with Canada and the U.S. But they were threatened through Lake Champlain, because Lake Champlain went up into Canada. So Canada could drop the boats right in, sail down into America. And so, to counter the hostile attempts from this quarter, the command of the American squadron on this lake was entrusted to Commodore Thomas McDonald. Quite an interesting leader. The defense of Plattsburgh on the ground troops, were dependent on the exertions of General Macomb and his gallant little army. They called that a little army because it was little compared to what was coming. In September of 1814, an attack was anticipated on this youthful commander's accordingly, and on the 11th of that month, the expected event took place. Several days the enemy had been on his way. They knew he was coming down. They were coming by land and water. And it was well understood that an attack would be made at the same time by his land and naval forces. They would be pincered together. Commander McDonald determined to await at anchor the approach of the latter. He didn't go looking for him, he waited there. They only had 4 ships in the American line. Something like 11 or more ships in the British line. So you can see he's trying to set himself up in a strategic place. You know, he had less resources. So General Macomb was frequently advised to retreat. Remember, he had that little force. He was invited to retreat to spare the blood and lives of his quote-unquote apology for an army. That's what they referred to it as. So it wasn't just a little army, it was an apology for an army. And he was told to retreat, keep retreating, in order to save Plattsburgh from the fate of a conquered country. But his decision, the decision which he took, and to which he unwaveringly adhered, in his apparently forlorn situation, proved the strength of his moral courage and the wisdom of his measures. He fought gallantly. We won on both land and sea. And when we won, we were gentlemen about it. In the graveyard, they buried Americans with British on either side. You had British here, Americans there, they're right together. You know? So we treated them fair. I would just say we treated them like gentlemen. We didn't fight like gentlemen. They always said those Americans don't fight the right way. You know, they come out in that long line shooting. We shoot from behind trees. You betcha. I'm not standing in that long line. I don't know, I didn't come from a rich family, but my mom didn't raise no idiots. I'm getting behind something a musket ball can take. You got to throw a cannon in that baby. So anyways, you know, we had people of courage up there. We were really stamina. We weren't just a ragamuffin. We weren't trained as it. Now these people coming down from Great Britain, you know, these were veterans of the Napoleonic War. These were, you know, veterans. But we were not to be looked at like that. We had no deserters. No deserters. Small an army as we had. They had a number of people missing and run away. The British did. So we can be proud that even had we lost, we held our own up there. So here, Bliss writes, Sylvester Bliss writes in the biography for William Miller here. He says, many occurrences served to weaken my confidence, William said. William's right. Many occurrences served to weaken my confidence in the correctness of the statistical principles. So he was no longer, he was being affected by being a deist. His principles were being shattered. I was led frequently to compare this country to that of the children of Israel before whom God drove out the inhabitants of their land. And it seemed to me that the Supreme Being must have watched over the interests of this country, and in a special manner, and delivered us from the hands of our enemies. I was particularly impressed with this view when I was in the Battle of Plattsburgh, when with 1,500 regulars and about 4,000 volunteers, we defeated the British, who were 15,000 strong. We being so successful, also successful at the same time, in an engagement with the British fleet on the lake. McDonald had an interesting maneuver. The ships had guns on both sides. So if your enemy is on this side, you can only use these guns. So when they fired these guns broadside, now you want to use these guns because they got a load. So the ship's moving, they fire, he drops his anchor in the rear. Well, the force of you moving, this dropping creates a radius for a circle and swings the ship around. And as he come around and came in line, they fired from that side too. So he gave them 2 blows quickly compared to what they had. And that's how he took them. So it was quite an interesting maneuver. But here's the one statement. This is our origin statement. This is the thing that started it all in the mind of a deist. At the commencement of the battle, Miller said, we looked upon our own defeat as almost certain, and yet we were victorious. So surprising a result against such odds did seem to me the work of a mightier power than man. Now, a deist, God doesn't intervene into the affairs of man. What did he just witness? God intervening into the affairs of man. And it threw him for a loop. He wasn't converted, but it put him on that path. 2 years later, he would be reading a sermon from a book about raising children in 16. He studied the Bible for 2 years. In 1818, came to the conclusion that in about 25 years from that time, the affairs of mankind will be wrapped up and Jesus will come. This all put him on the trajectory for his message that he would give, the birth of our church. We're sitting here today because of how he was affected at that battle and the things and the events that followed that formed the church. Yeah. So as you see here, he was that first domino, not just in his message, but there in his mind to turn to God. That God would lead him to the message that would lead to the followers and the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's the origin of who we are. Now, if you can find me a better origin, I'm all ears. And what was the message that was given to Miller that day? Tell it to the world. It's your message, my message. Still. Share that gospel. We're kingdom builders. We're building the kingdom even now as we prepare for Christ. Let's pray. Dear Father, we thank you so much that we're in a movement here that's called by you to give this great message at this time in salvation history. We have a pedigree. We have a history. We know where it comes from. We understand it now, and that we feel that we're part of this. We share with Brother William. Tell it to the world. Those words you gave him that morning in his study now ring in our heads too. Go tell it to the world as we prepare for Christ to come. Help us to go out into the world, Father, to be a blessing to others as we prepare for Jesus. My prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.